Today, I want to share with you a story of resilience, of loneliness, and of a love that began in the unlikeliest of places. It is the story of a woman named Clara Whitfield and a man known only to some as Jared Blackthorn. In the spring of 1886, the Arizona Territory was a land of hard winds and harder lives. Clara had been alone on her ranch for nearly a year. Since the fever carried off her husband, folks in town told her she should sell the land and head east where she might be safer, where her nights wouldn't echo with coyotes and her days wouldn't grind her to exhaustion. But Clara could not bring herself to leave. The soil here carried her husband's sweat, her father's dreams, and her own stubborn heartbeat. Every day was labor. Every fence rail, every patch of leaking roof, every cracked water barrel weighed on her shoulders. The land needed more than 2 hands, and she had only 1 pair left. But Clara Whitfield was not a woman who surrendered easily. She rose with the sun, worked until the shadows fell, and whispered only to herself at night that she would endure. It was on one such morning, as she hammered a splintered fence rail back into place, that Clara noticed it, a plume of dust on the horizon. Thin at first, curling steady against the pale sky, growing larger with each breath of wind. Her gout tightened. Few came this far without reason, and most reasons in this land were not good ones. She wiped the sweat from her brow with a gloved hand and reached for the rifle propped against the corral. By the time the plume drew near, her finger rested along the steel, her pulse steady but alert. The rider came into view, a dun-colored horse, flanks lean from miles of trail, and upon it, a man tall, broad-shouldered, his frame cutting a sharp line against the desert light. He slowed his horse to a careful walk as he neared her gate. And when he stopped, he raised a single hand, palm out, a gesture of peace. Clara kept the rifle firm across her body, her voice steady, though her heart pressed hard against her ribs. "You're on private land." The man's voice came low, deep, carrying faint traces of another language beneath his English. "I know," he said evenly. "Name's Jared Blackthorn. I saw smoke from your chimney. Thought I'd see if there was trouble." Clara studied him, the long knife at his belt, the lean horse, the dark eyes that did not flick or shift the way a drifter's often did. His skin bore the bronze of years in the sun. His black hair braided over one shoulder with a single raven feather tied near the end. He wore no hat, letting the light strike sharp across high cheekbones and a jaw carved from endurance. "No trouble here," Clara replied, "and I'm not expecting company." "Not looking for trouble," Jared answered. "Lost a shoe on my mare 2 days back. Fixed it as best I could. But I've been riding since without a hot meal. Thought I might trade some work for food." She hesitated. Another mouth to feed was the last thing she needed. But his eyes, steady, dark, and unflinching, held none of the twitch she had learned to watch for in men who drifted from one lie to another. Even his horse told a story, ribs showing. Yes, but its coat brushed clean, cared for with patience. Not the kind of neglect one saw in thieves. Clara's voice softened, though she kept the rifle angled across her chest. "What kind of work?" "Any you've got," Jared replied, nodding toward the fence. "That brake could use a brace rail before it bows." Her throat tightened. That fence had been leaning for weeks, waiting for strength she barely had. And though every instinct warned her against strangers, another voice whispered, a quieter one, that she was tired of silence, tired of carrying every burden alone. "You can water your horse at the trough," she said finally. "I've beans on the stove." Jared inclined his head. A small gesture of respect. Thank you. She watched carefully as he dismounted. On the ground, he stood taller than she expected, his presence filling the space between them, though he moved with an unhurried steadiness. Leading his mare to the trough, he let the animal drink in measured pulls. As if mindful of what was given, his every motion was deliberate, efficient. He did not gawk at the land, nor glance around, the way most men did when sizing up what could be taken. He simply saw and remembered. Inside the cabin, Clara ladled beans into a tin bowl and slid a heel of bread beside it. She kept her distance when Jared stepped in, the rifle still within reach. He removed his thin leather gloves before sitting, nodding his thanks before taking the meal. He ate slowly, not as a man testing his welcome, but as one who had learned to stretch hunger into patience. You been alone here long? He asked between bites. Since last March, Clara replied. My husband didn't make it through the winter. Jared paused, his spoon still for a moment. That's hard. Clara shrugged, though her voice caught in her throat. Land doesn't stop needing work just because you're on your own. That's true, he said quietly, finishing the last of his meal. I've seen too many places left to the wind. When he was done, he set the bowl neatly on the table, not sloppily as so many did, but with care, as if it belonged. He rose. Let me see to that fence. By afternoon, the break was braced solid. Jared had also checked the barn roof for leaks and tightened the chicken run gate without being asked. He didn't talk much while he worked, but Clara noticed the way his eyes took in details: her leaning water barrel, the sagging porch rail, the way one corral post leaned west. He did not speak of them, only noticed, when the sun slid low, Jared led his horse to the shed. I'll bed down here, he said simply. If you've got an old blanket, I can make do. Clara fetched her late husband's trail blanket from the trunk. Worn but clean. It felt heavy in her hands as she passed it to him. You moving on tomorrow? She asked. That's the plan, Jared said. Unless you've more work. Her mouth opened, then closed. She wasn't used to company, and yet the fence had been leaning for months. The roof needed mending, and the silence of her nights had been louder than she could bear. I've got a roof, wants patching, she said finally. You fix that. I'll see you fed another day. Jared gave one small nod, the kind of nod that wasted no words. All right. He turned toward the shed, the last of the evening light catching across his shoulders. Clara stood in the cooling yard, rifle still within reach, but her hand no longer clenched around it. That night, she kept the rifle propped beside her bed, but as she listened to the wind against the shutters, she found herself thinking not of fear, but of how the air around her land already felt different. For the first time in a long while, the silence did not seem quite so heavy. The next morning came with a hard desert light, the kind that scraped every ridge and stone into sharp relief. Clara stepped out with her pail for the chickens, half expecting to find Jared still asleep in the shed. But he was already at work, crouched low near the fence he had braced the day before, running his palm along the rail, as if checking whether the wood itself had settled in the night. His mare grazed quietly in the corral, and the man himself looked as though he belonged there, though Clara knew better than to think belonging came so easily. By mid-morning he had a ladder leaned against the barn roof, prying loose shingles and nailing replacements with steady precision. Clara busied herself with sewing a feed sack, though her eyes betrayed her, drifting again and again toward the movement of his shoulders against the sky. He worked as though every nail mattered, Every swing of the hammer a decision. No waste. No idle gestures. When he came down, wiping his brow with the back of his wrist, he asked simply, "What else?" Clara almost smiled at the bluntness of it. "You don't stop, do you? Not while the light's good." Jared replied, and so the day unfolded, tightening chicken wire, stacking wood, hauling water without being asked. Clara found herself unsettled, not by his presence, but by how natural it felt to have another pair of hands at work beside hers. She had forgotten what it was like to hear a second rhythm in the yard, to feel the silence filled, not with loneliness, but with quiet purpose. By noon, she set a pot of stew on the porch table, rabbit, beans, onion, and offered him a bowl. He took it with a nod. Sitting on the steps to eat, he did not wolf it down despite the labor he had given all morning. He ate as if every bite deserved its time. Clara watched him over the rim of her cup. "You always eat that slow?" she asked. He looked up. Dark eyes, steady. Food's not something to rush. The answer stirred something faint in her chest. Her father had eaten that way too, chewing as though to honor the work that brought the meal to the table. Afterward, Jared rinsed his bowl in the trough, using a rag from his own pack, then set about stacking the split wood by the door. Clara found herself both irritated and relieved. Irritated because his presence forced her to admit how much she had let the place slip. Relieved because for the first time in months, she did not feel like the land was defeating her. It was late in the afternoon when the sound of wagon wheels reached the yard. Clara stiffened. She knew that sound, the uneven creak of Tom Keeley's old wagon. Sure enough, he reined in at her gate, his eyes sweeping the yard until they landed on Jared. Keeley's mouth tightened. "Didn't expect to see you keeping company," he said, loud enough for both of them to hear. "Just getting some work done," Clara replied. Her voice even. Keeley's gaze flicked from Jared's broad frame to the tightened chicken wire, the braced fence, the stacked wood. His lip curled. "That right." Jared stood a few feet away, hauling kindling, his expression unreadable. He neither moved nor spoke. "You know," Keeley drawled, spitting into the dust. "Folks in town talk. Say, Apache men never stay unless they mean to take something. One way or another." Clara felt heat rise in her chest. She gripped the gate rail, her jaw set. "I don't listen much to talk. Tom." He squinted at her, testing her stance. After a beat, he snapped the reins, rolling off down the road. Dust hung in the air long after his wagon disappeared. When the sound faded, Clara turned. Jared was setting the kindling by the porch, his face unchanged. Though she saw the flicker in his eyes, something caught between weariness and restraint. "You don't have to mind him," she said, more sharply than she intended. "I've heard worse," Jared replied. Voice, even, doesn't change what work needs doing. With that, he picked up the hatchet and split another log, the motion clean and final, as though Keeley's words had been chopped in two along with the wood. That night, the desert cooled fast. The heat bled from the land as soon as the sun slipped behind the mountains. Clara brought out a lamp for the porch and set 2 mugs of coffee on the step between them. Jared sat with his elbows on his knees. "Quiet. Steady. You said you've been alone since last March," he said at length. She nodded, fingers warming against the mug. "Fever took my husband. Was just me after that. No brothers, no children. Nobody came calling. Not even for courting." Jared didn't answer right away, and she was grateful. Most men would have filled the silence with pity. or some clumsy words. He simply waited, letting her share what she wanted. Or nothing at all. I've managed fine, she said finally. Some days are longer than others. Is all? Long days are easier with more than one set of hands, he said. Clara looked at him over the rim of her mug. You planning on staying long enough to make them easier? His mouth curved just slightly. The faintest trace of humor. Depends if there's more work. She gestured toward the north fence. Post needs replacing. Then I'll see to it tomorrow. Later. From her window, she watched him settle into the shed. He spread the old blanket she'd given him, laid his bedroll on top, and placed his knife within reach before lying down. It was the way of a man who had never stopped expecting trouble. Clara, let the curtain fall. She told herself again that this was only a trade labor for food. But as she banked the fire, she felt something stirring beneath that thought. Something harder to dismiss. The next morning broke with a clean desert light. Clara stepped outside, her coffee steaming in the cool air. Jared was already saddling his mare. Going somewhere, she asked. Riverbed, he said. Cinching the strap. Mesquite should be in bloom. Bees will be working. Good sign for planting. She tilted her head, puzzled. You want to check on flowers, not just flowers. You can tell a season's worth from how the bees move. He glanced up, eyes catching hers. Come along. I'll show you. Clara hesitated. The north fence could wait. She had patched fences all her life, but she had never been invited to see the land through another's eyes. All right, she said softly. Give me a minute. As she turned back toward the cabin, she caught herself almost smiling. The silence between them was shifting. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but the first fragile strand of something else. Something not yet named, but already felt. The first sign came with the wind. That afternoon had been bright and steady. The kind of day when the air seemed to rest on the land. Clara was stacking wood by the porch when the sky shifted. A hot gust rolled in from the south, scattering grit across the yard and rattling the barn doors. She looked up just as the light dimmed, and the smell of rain, sharp and metallic, carried on the air. Jared emerged from the chicken run, his eyes on the horizon. Dragons pulling the storm in fast, he said, his voice low but certain. Clara shaded her eyes. Squinting toward the mountains, a wall of cloud was climbing over the peaks, bruised purple at the base, climbing higher with each heartbeat. It wasn't supposed to rain until next week, she murmured. The desert doesn't keep a calendar. He swung into the saddle in one motion, urging his mare toward the pasture. I'll check the river before it hits. The wind doubled by the time Clara had gathered the wash from the line. Sheets snapped like whips around her legs. The air charged with a rising hum. She had just hauled the last armful inside when a crack of thunder split the sky so close it made her teeth ring. Moments later, Jared galloped back through the gate, rain already soaking his buckskin vest and plastering his braid to his back. He swung down, leading his horse into the shed. His words were clipped. Urgent, that river's rising. If it keeps. The low pasture goes under and takes half your fence with it. Clara's voice felt thin under the roar of the wind. We don't keep stock there this time of year. Doesn't matter. If the bank cuts deeper, you'll lose more than fence. Lightning flashed, and the thunder followed instantly, rolling through the ground beneath their boots. Rain came hard, slanting sideways, stinging Clara's face. Jared pulled the old trail blanket over his mare, then caught her arm. Inside, the cabin was dim and close, the windows rattling under the storm's fury. Clara set a kettle on the stove more out of habit than need, her hands moving fast to mask the tremor in them. Jared peeled off his sodden vest and shirt, laying them by the fire. She pulled one of her husband's old cotton shirts from the trunk and held it out without looking at him. "You'll need this." He slid it on. Sleeves, a little short on his long arms. "You always this prepared." "I try," she said, adjusting the kettle. "Storms here don't give much warning." For a time, the only sound was the rain hammering the roof, the steady whistle of the kettle. Jared leaned against the table, watching her quietly. His presence filled the cabin without pressing against her. It was not the presence of danger, but of someone who carried his weight and expected storms. "How long have you been keeping this place by yourself?" he asked. Clara kept her eyes on the rising steam. "Since my husband died. Nearly a year now. Didn't have much choice." "You did," Jared said gently. "Most would have left." Her jaw tightened. "I don't like leaving things behind." He didn't answer right away. The rain filled the silence between them. Then, after a long moment, his voice dropped lower. "My brother didn't make it back from the war." Clara turned, startled by the sharpness in his tone. "I didn't know you had a brother." "Most don't." His gaze fell to his hands. "He was younger, reckless, thought he could outrun bullets. I made it back. I've been asking why ever since." The words settled heavy in the room. Clara set 2 mugs of coffee on the table, sliding one toward him. She didn't press, didn't demand. She simply let the storm outside carry the weight of his grief. At last she said, "What was he like?" Jared's mouth curved faintly. "Faster than me with a rope, always ready to fight for something, even when it wasn't worth it." His eyes lifted, dark and steady. "I miss him every day." Clara nodded slowly. "I never had brothers. Never had anyone come calling either." "Not really. Not for courting." Their eyes met across the steam of the coffee, and neither looked away. There was no pity in his gaze, no judgment, only the quiet understanding of someone who had carried loneliness in his own skin. The storm eased from a roar to a steady patter, but the river had already swelled beyond its banks. Jared stood, pulling on his boots. "We need to cut a trench before it chews more of your field." Clara blinked. In this weather, only when it matters. Together they stepped into the rain. The ground was slick, sucking at their boots as they made their way to the north edge of the property. The wash ran fast. Water, the color of rust. Jared drove his shovel into the mud, marking a line. "Here. We'll pull it wide. Draw it away from the fence." Clara gripped her own shovel, forcing it into the wet earth. The soil was heavy, clinging to the blade. But she worked beside him, matching her rhythm to his. Rain soaked her hair, ran down her arms, plastered her dress to her frame. Still, she did not stop. Jared slowed his pace when her breath grew ragged, never rushing ahead, never letting her fall behind. The trench began to take shape, channeling the water in a new path. The current caught, dragging the runoff away from the fence line. By the time they returned to the cabin, the clouds had begun to break apart. Thin light spilling across the drenched yard. Inside, the fire's heat felt doubled. Clara hung her sweater by the hearth, sinking into the chair across from him. "You're not what I expected," she said quietly. Jared raised one brow. "And what was that?" "I'm not sure, but it wasn't this." She gestured toward the patched roof. The braced fence, the fresh trench outside. Most men who pass through just want a place to rest. He held her gaze for a long moment. "I'm not most men," The silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full, alive, waiting. For the first time since her husband's death, Clara felt the walls of the cabin holding not just her grief, but something else, something that might, with time, grow stronger than the storm they had just endured. The storm passed, leaving the land washed clean, the air sharp with the scent of wet earth. Clara rose the next morning to find the sky pale and endless, streaked with the thin white of high clouds. The wash no longer roared, but whispered as it moved, a softer sound that seemed to echo her own quiet relief. Jared was saddling his mare when she stepped outside with her coffee. He looked up, the faintest curve in his mouth. Rivers dropped. He said, "Mesquite should be blooming by now." Clara tilted her head. "Mesquite? You mean the trees?" He nodded. "Pods for meal, bark for medicine, blossoms for bees. You can read a whole season in one grove." His eyes lingered on hers. "Come, I'll show you." For a moment, she hesitated. Fances leaned. Posts needed setting, yet her hands itched for something different than mending wood or shoveling mud. Something quieter, something that belonged to the land itself, not just to the struggle of surviving it. "All right," she said softly. "Give me a minute." They rode down into a wash, where the soil turned darker and richer. Jared pointed things out as they went. A patch of wild onions hidden in the brush, the broad pads of prickly pear swelling with buds, the narrow stalk of agave beginning its climb. He spoke not like a teacher, but like a man remembering what his grandfather had shown him. "Yucca root makes soap," he said, tapping his hand against a cluster. "Beat it right. It'll lather enough to keep you alive when water's scarce." Clara smiled faintly. Never thought of soap as something you'd find instead of buy. Out here, everything's something you find or make. They crossed the San Pedro where it ran shallow, stones slick under the horses' hooves. On the far side, the mesquite trees waited, their branches bent low with pale yellow blossoms. The air hummed with bees, thick but gentle, and the sweetness of pollen rode the breeze. Jared dismounted first, tying his reins to a crooked limb. Clara followed, though her knot earned a quiet chuckle from him. "That won't hold a thing," he said. He retied it quickly, his fingers moving with practiced ease. "There, won't rub her raw." She shook her head, smiling despite herself. "Guess you've tied a few horses." "A few." They stepped beneath the branches together, brushing aside the fronds heavy with blossoms. Sunlight filtered through in thin streams, catching the dust motes that swirled in the air. Clara reached up, letting the flowers brush her fingertips. "They're beautiful," she whispered. Jared plucked a small cluster from a low branch, careful not to break more than he needed. He placed it in her hand, the petals trembling in her palm. She pressed them to her cheek. "Feels like spring is apologizing for the winter." Jared gave her a long, steady look. "You always talk like that." "Like what?" "Like you see more than what's in front of you." She shrugged, suddenly aware of how close they stood. Ow! The space between them had narrowed, without either of them stepping forward. The blossoms trembled in her hand, their fragrance rising in the warm air. "I never learned much small talk," she admitted. Then, before she could stop herself, the words slipped out. "Low, fragile. I've never been kissed." The confession hung between them, heavier than the storm had been, yet more tender. Jared's gaze did not waver. He didn't step forward. He didn't reach out. His voice came low, steady as stone. Then we'll start slow. Clara felt her pulse in her ears, each beat louder than the last. I wouldn't know how, she whispered. You don't have to know anything. For a long moment, they stood there, the hum of bees weaving around them, the golden air thick with the smell of blossoms. The world seemed to hold its breath. Clara's shoulders eased, the tightness inside her loosening just a fraction. At last they sat together beneath one of the larger trees, their backs resting against the same trunk, a handspan of space between them. Jared spoke of how his people had ground the pods into meal, boiled bark into medicine, gathered blossoms for tea. He told her of mornings beside the river with his grandfather, listening to the old man speak of waters before fences had cut the land into pieces. Do you miss it? She asked. Every day. He said simply, but missing doesn't change what's gone. You carry what you can. Leave the rest behind. Clara turned the small cluster of blossoms in her hand, the petals soft against her skin. She thought of her own losses, the fever, the silence, the weight of a house too large for one pair of hands. She thought of how, for the first time since her husband's death, she did not feel invisible on the ride back. Little was said, yet the air between them felt different, not heavier, not lighter, changed, as though the line that had kept them strangers had shifted, subtle but certain, into something new. When Clara set the blossoms in a tin cup on her table that evening, their fragrance filled the room. Every time she caught their sweetness, she remembered his words. Then we'll start slow. The invitation came folded in a boy's hand. His hat tipped awkwardly at Clara's gate. Mrs. Weller was hosting the spring dance in Benson. And Clara, to her surprise, was written down among the names. She had not been to such a gathering since her father's health first failed, long before fever stole her husband. At first, she meant to set it aside, let the night pass unnoticed. But Jared had seen the slip of paper on the table. His voice was quiet when he asked. Thinking of going, Clara shrugged. Uncertain. Feels strange. People remember me as the woman who sat in corners, carrying pie. No one touched. Not much else. If you want to go, he said, steady as ever, I'll go with you. It was a simple promise, yet it echoed inside her long after he spoke it. 2 weeks later, the evening air was warm as they rode into town together. Clara wore a pale cotton dress she had hemmed herself, her hands shaking more from doubt than excitement. Jared beside her looked cut from the land itself, broad shoulders under a clean white shirt and buckskin vest. His hair freshly braided, with a strip of red cloth tied above the raven feather. Lanterns strung across the schoolhouse cast soft circles of light. Fiddle music spilled out the open windows, laughter mixing with the smell of roast beef and coffee. Clara felt every eye turn when they stepped from the horses. Some gazes softened with surprise. Others sharpened with suspicion. Jared offered his arm. She hesitated only a breath before taking it. Together they crossed the threshold. Inside, desks had been pushed to the walls, leaving space for couples to move across the worn boards. Clara's pulse quickened, her palms damp, but when Jared placed his hand at the small of her back, she found her shoulders settling, as though his steadiness carried into her. You don't have to dance, he said quietly. I want to, she answered, surprising herself. The fiddle struck up a lively tune. Jared did not rush her, did not pull. His steps were small, close, guiding her gently. His palm was rough against hers, but his hold was steady. Clara let herself move to the rhythm, the room blurring until she felt only the sure weight of his hand and the quiet space he carved for her. When the song ended, he did not release her hand right away. And when the next tune began, he led her again. His steps unhurried, his gaze never straying. For the first time in years, Clara did not feel like a shadow at the edge of a room. She felt seen, yet whispers moved as quickly as the music. She caught the glance of Mrs. Keeley. Lips pressed thin, she heard the mutter of two men near the door, one shaking his head, even as others nodded with kindness, offering smiles or a word of welcome. The undercurrent of suspicion stirred the air when they stepped outside for breath. The night was cooler, lanterns swaying in the breeze. Clara exhaled, her nerves steadying, until a voice cut through the quiet. Blackthorn. They turned to see a man approaching from the shadows of the street, a traitor Clara recognized. Luis Vargas. His smile carried no warmth. At his waist hung a red sash, bright against the dark. Didn't think I'd find you at a dance, Vargas said. Strange work for a man the army once called friend, then traitor. Clara felt the shift in the air, sharp and sudden. Jared's jaw tightened, but his voice remained even. Safe travels, Vargas. The traitor's gaze slid to Clara, lingering just long enough to make her stomach knot. Then he looked back at Jared. Women forget what men have done. Towns forget, too. But not everyone. With that, he turned, disappearing down the street. Dust curling up behind his boots. Silence followed, heavy as the storm had been days before. Clara searched Jared's face, to the lines of it harder now, shadowed by old battles she did not know. Is it true? She asked at last. Her voice barely more than breath. Jared's eyes met hers, dark and steady. Truth depends on who's telling it. She wanted to ask more. She wanted to demand the story behind the word traitor. But something in his expression told her the wound was not ready to be uncovered. They stood together beneath the lantern glow, the hum of the dance drifting faintly through the open door. Whispers might follow them. Doubt might linger. But Clara knew one thing more clearly than any rumor. This was the man who had braced her fence, saved her field, and stood beside her through storm and silence. The man who had guided her hand across a dance floor with care, not pride. And as she looked at him, she realized she already knew her choice. Trust the talk of town, or trust the man who had changed the weight of her days. Her fingers slid into his steady, despite the tremor in her chest. Come back inside, she said softly. I'm not finished dancing. The moon was high by the time they reached the cabin, silver light spilling across the yard, catching on the mesquite and the curve of the river beyond. The ride home had been quiet. Clara's thoughts were not. She heard again the whispers in the schoolhouse, the trader's cold words outside, the unspoken weight in Jared's steady gaze. Yet when she looked at him riding tall in the saddle, the faint gleam of lantern light still caught in the braid over his shoulder, her heart steadied. Whatever the town said, whatever shadows lingered from his past, she had seen the truth in his hands, in his silence, in the way he had carried her through the dance as though she were worth being seen. Inside, she lit the small lamp, its glow spilling across the wooden walls. Jared set their things aside, as he always did, neat and deliberate. She thought of how many nights she had left him to the cot near the hearth, or the shed outside, telling herself it was safer, cleaner, proper. But tonight, the thought of sending him away made her chest ache. Clara reached for his hand. Her fingers trembled, But she did not let go. "Stay," she said simply. His eyes searched hers, dark and unwavering. He did not ask for more, did not press. He only waited. She drew a breath, steadying herself, then led him not to the hearth, not to the shed, but toward her room. The lamp flickered against the walls, shadows moving with them. They lay side by side, boots set aside, clothes still carrying the faint scents of wood smoke and lantern oil. Neither spoke. Words were not needed. The silence was no longer heavy, no longer hollow. It was full, alive with warmth, with presence, with the quiet weight of two people who had carried loneliness too long and now, at last, had found it easing. Jared's hand rested over hers, his touch steady, unhurried. Clara felt her breath match the rhythm of his. No rush, no fire meant to consume, only the gentleness of being seen, of being held without question. For years, her nights had echoed with absence, with the sound of wind against shutters and the ache of a bed too wide. Now, as the first light of morning crept through the cracks, she woke to the steady warmth of another heartbeat beside her. There was no declaration, no promise spoken aloud. But as Clara turned her face toward him and found his eyes already open, already watching her with that same quiet strength, she knew the truth. This was not just labor traded for food, not just shelter against storms. This was the first step into something that could no longer be sent back to the shed. Something that would not be silenced by whispers or broken by doubt. Two scarred souls had found each other in the wide, merciless land. And together, in silence and in steadiness, they had begun to build a home within each other's presence. The weeks after the dance slipped into a rhythm Clara had not known she craved. Days began with morning light creeping through the shutters, with the smell of coffee rising from the stove. She was no longer alone in the silence. There were 2 mugs on the table now, 2 sets of boots by the door. Jared's presence was not loud, not demanding. It was steady. He built a smokehouse from mesquite poles, cut and lashed with care. He planed boards for shelves in the pantry, shaping them smooth as if the smallest detail mattered. When the cabin grew too tight for the tools, baskets, and jars they had begun to collect, he added a room just enough for storage and a cot. His hands shaped the place into something more than survival. It became a home. Clara matched him with her own work. She dug a larger garden in the back plot, turning the damp soil with a hoe, planting beans, squash, and corn. She kept chickens in earnest now. No longer a handful scratching near the coop, but a flock enough to feed and trade. Her days filled with sound, the rustle of feathers, the creak of a bucket, the low hum of bees drifting near the flowers Jared had shown her. They spoke little while they worked, but the silence was no longer empty. It carried the rhythm of trust, of companionship. Supper came with quiet conversation, sometimes only a few words, sometimes a memory shared across the lamplight. At times they simply sat together, her hand resting on his knee, his arm draped along the back of her chair. It was not the fire of sudden passion, but the warmth of a steady flame, one that held through storm and season alike. In town, whispers gave way to nods. At first, people stared when they rode in together, the widow Whitfield and the Apache scout. But seasons passed, and eyes grew used to the sight of them, side by side, at the mercantile, trading eggs for flour or cloth. The rumors thinned when neighbors saw the fence lines mended, the garden thriving, the cabin grown sturdier each year. Some still muttered, but others smiled with quiet respect. What had begun as talk of scandal shifted, little by little, into acceptance of a family being built. Years turned. The San Pedro ran low and clear in summer, heavy with willow and cottonwood at its banks. Autumn brought crisp winds, the scent of mesquite smoke curling from the chimney. Each season left its mark, and through each one, Clara and Jared worked side by side. In the fall of their 3rd year together, Clara gave birth to a daughter. They named her Lena, not after kin, for neither had family left to honor, but because the name felt strong and simple. Like the child herself, Jared carved her a cradle from pine, smoothing the rails until they were satin beneath his calloused hands. Clara stitched a cap from scraps of the pale shawl she had once worn to the spring dance. Their daughter's first cry filled the cabin, breaking a silence that had once seemed endless. Life grew busier, but not less steady. Mornings began with the baby's cries mingling with the rooster's crow. Days filled with chores, multiplied by the small demands of a child. But every task carried the hum of shared purpose. Jared's boots scuffed against the porch as he carried wood. Clara's voice sang soft lullabies as she rocked Lena near the fire. Evenings ended with the 3 of them together, Clara's hand resting on Jared's arm. Lena's tiny fingers curled around theirs. The land around them still held its hardships. Storms came, and drought threatened. Neighbors spoke carelessly at times, and the weight of old battles lingered in Jared's silence. But none of it unraveled what they had built. For the first time since loss had hollowed her days, Clara no longer measured life by absence. She measured it by mornings shared, by fences repaired, by laughter slipping from her daughter's mouth like sunlight breaking across a ridge, in a land that asked everything of those who dared to claim it. Clara and Jared had given their labor, their trust, and their wounds. What they received in return was not ease, nor riches, nor a story written in grand deeds. It was steadier than that, quieter and deeper. They had built something that lasted. Years slipped by like water through the San Pedro, sometimes slow, sometimes swift, always moving. Seasons carried storms and droughts, harvests both lean and generous. Through it all, Clara and Jared endured, not with grand declarations, but with steady hands and a love built one day at a time. One autumn evening, the air carried the first bite of chill. The mesquite smoke rose from the chimney, curling into a lavender sky. Clara sat on the porch, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders. In her arms, little Lena had fallen asleep, her dark hair damp against Clara's neck, her small breaths rising and falling in perfect rhythm. From across the pasture came the sound of boots on earth, measured and familiar. Jared walked in from the fence line, his shirt still damp from the day's work, his stride unhurried. He climbed the steps and settled beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. For a long while, they said nothing, only watched the sun sink behind the ridge, spilling gold and rose across the horizon. Clara's voice broke the quiet, soft and hesitant. "Do you ever regret staying?" Jared turned his head toward her, his gaze steady as the land itself. "Every sunrise proves I don't." Clara pressed her cheek against Lena's hair, her heart full in a way words could never carry. She thought of the day she had first seen him through a plume of dust, a stranger on a tired horse, asking only for water and a meal in exchange for work. She thought of the whispers in town, the storm that nearly took her land, the first blossoms of mesquite in her hand, all the moments that had shaped them, piece by piece, into this life. The frontier was never easy. Storms rose and faded. Land shifted. Banks cut. Fences fell. Seasons turned with little mercy. But what they had built together anchored in trust. Forged in silence was something the wind could never carry away. The porch grew darker as the last light drained from the sky. Clara leaned into Jared's shoulder. Lena warm between them. The night settling soft around their home. They did not need to speak. The truth lived in the quiet. In the steady presence beside her. In the strength of a man who had once been a stranger and had become her anchor. And, as the stars pricked the sky, Clara knew this was not the story of survival alone. It was the story of belonging. On the frontier, storms rise and fade. Land shifts and seasons turn. But what they built together, anchored in trust, forged in silence, was something the wind could never carry away. Now I ask you, dear listener, would you have trusted the stranger or sent him on his way? If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more heartfelt frontier romances, tales of survival, love, and the strength it takes to build a life against the odds.